The Toledo War was a tense and unusual conflict between Ohio and Michigan over a narrow strip of land along Lake Erie known as the Toledo Strip. Although often called a war, it was largely a political and legal struggle, marked by rivalry, pride, and competing claims rather than sustained violence. The roots of the dispute can be traced back to the late 18th century, when early maps of the region were imprecise and sometimes contradictory. At the center of the problem were two different surveys that attempted to define the boundary between the future states. One was based on an east-to-west line drawn from the southern tip of Lake Michigan, while another angled line was drawn to ensure access to the mouth of the Maumee River, an important location for trade and transport. The confusion over these lines meant that both Ohio and Michigan believed they had a legitimate claim to the Toledo Strip. For Ohio, the area was crucial because it provided access to a natural harbor on Lake Erie, which would support economic growth through shipping and trade. For Michigan, which was still a territory at the time, control of the same land was seen as essential for its own development and future statehood. As population in the region increased during the early 19th century, the dispute became more urgent, since settlers, businesses, and local governments needed clear authority and legal certainty. Tensions rose sharply in the early 1830s as both sides took steps to assert control. Ohio attempted to organize local government in the disputed territory and include it within its own counties. In response, Michigan authorities moved to enforce their own laws in the same area. This led to a confusing situation where residents could be subject to competing jurisdictions, with officials from both sides trying to collect taxes and administer justice. The rivalry soon escalated beyond paperwork and legal arguments into a show of force. Both Ohio and Michigan called out their militias, which were groups of local men prepared to defend their claims if necessary. These forces gathered near the border, sometimes within sight of each other, creating a tense atmosphere. While there were a few minor clashes, including one incident where shots were fired but no one was seriously harmed, the conflict never developed into full-scale battle. Instead, it became a kind of standoff, with each side attempting to demonstrate strength without provoking a major fight. One of the most notable aspects of the dispute was the role of arrests and legal maneuvers. Officials from both sides sought to undermine the authority of the other by detaining rival officers and supporters. In one case, a sheriff from Michigan was arrested by Ohio authorities, while in another, Ohio supporters were detained under Michigan law. These incidents added to the sense of drama and conflict, even though they did not result in widespread violence. Newspapers of the time reported on these events with great interest, often exaggerating the seriousness of the situation and stirring public opinion. The conflict also had a significant political dimension at the national level. At the time, Michigan was seeking admission to the United States as a state, but its ongoing dispute with Ohio complicated the process. Leaders in Washington were concerned about setting a precedent for boundary conflicts and wanted to avoid encouraging similar disputes elsewhere. President Andrew Jackson became directly involved, as he needed to balance the interests of both sides while maintaining political support. Ohio was already a state and had greater influence, while Michigan, as a territory, had less power in national decision-making. Jackson ultimately supported Ohio's claim to the Toledo Strip, a decision influenced in part by political considerations, including the importance of Ohio in national elections. To resolve the dispute and allow Michigan to move forward, a compromise was proposed. Michigan would give up its claim to the Toledo Strip but would receive the Upper Peninsula in return. At the time, this land was seen by many as remote and less valuable, covered in forests and lacking clear economic potential. As a result, the people of Michigan were initially reluctant to accept the deal. After some debate and pressure, Michigan agreed to the compromise, and in 1837 it was admitted to the United States as a state. In the years that followed, it became clear that the Upper Peninsula held significant natural resources, including timber and rich mineral deposits such as iron and copper. This development changed perceptions of the outcome, leading many to view the agreement as beneficial to Michigan in the long term, even though it had lost the Toledo Strip. The Toledo War remains a fascinating example of how unclear boundaries and competing interests can lead to conflict even within a single nation. It highlights the importance of accurate mapping and legal clarity, as well as the role of politics in resolving disputes. Despite the mobilization of militias and the heated rhetoric of the time, the conflict is often remembered for its lack of serious violence and its somewhat humorous elements. The idea of two neighboring regions preparing for war over a narrow strip of land, only to resolve their differences through negotiation and compromise, has made it a notable episode in United States history. In a broader sense, the dispute illustrates the challenges faced during the expansion of the United States, when new territories were being organized and admitted as states. Boundaries drawn on paper did not always match the realities on the ground, and disagreements were almost inevitable. The Toledo War shows how such disagreements could be managed without descending into large-scale conflict, relying instead on political solutions and mutual concessions. It also serves as a reminder that outcomes which seem unfavorable at the time can later prove advantageous, as seen in Michigan's eventual gain from the resources of the Upper Peninsula. Today, the former Toledo Strip is firmly part of Ohio, and the boundary between the two states is clearly defined. The episode is remembered more as a curious historical footnote than a true war, yet it offers valuable insights into the dynamics of territorial disputes, the influence of economic interests, and the ways in which leadership and compromise can prevent conflict from escalating.